Our next speaker is Jamie Parker, also a Member of Parliament. Jamie is the member for Balmain and is the Greens New South Wales spokesperson on uranium. As Mayor of Leichhardt, Jamie was active in the international organisation Mayors for Peace, based in Hiroshima, which aims to abolish nuclear weapons. Jamie recently travelled to Malaysia to work with opposition MPs and activists to oppose the Australian Lynas rare earth refining facility at Gebeng near Kuantan, and he continues to support the community in its campaign to stop the processing and disposal of this radioactive material. So welcome, Jamie.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to the Indigenous people that are here this evening, particularly Auntie, who's a member of my local constituency. Well, our efforts to oppose the government's plans to make New South Wales a nuclear state is critical. It's critical for our environment, it's critical for worker safety, it's critical for our Indigenous communities and for the future of renewable energy. But most importantly, it's critical for the international efforts to abolish nuclear weapons and to abolish the chances of another 3 Mile Island, another Chernobyl or another Fukushima. As many of you know here, we Greens fought strongly against the government's legislation to allow uranium exploration here in New South Wales. The Greens have got a long, proud history of fighting against uranium mining, nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And I'm too pleased that we have Luke here this evening and the support of New South Wales Labor in opposing what is a small step towards mining, which is the legislation which has been passed on exploration. Because we know it's not just about exploration, it's a precursor to the expansion of the uranium mining industry to New South Wales, bringing with it all the devastating impacts on communities and the environment that history has shown us is unavoidable. I want to talk about 2 key facts. One, the dangers of the uranium industry are well documented and devastating to the environment and to communities. And number 2, that there is no known method to safely deal with the nuclear waste produced by the nuclear industry. The uranium industry in Australia has been an environmental disaster. It's plagued with a litany of spills, leaks, reporting failures, licence breaches, and as Luke mentioned, the Senate report in 2003 in diplomatic speak said, quote, underperformance and non-compliance. We don't need to look far to look at the lasting toxic legacy of uranium mining in Australia. There are real examples. The Rum Jungle mine in the Northern Territory has been closed since 1971. And since then, we've seen an ongoing struggle to manage uranium tailings and water contamination. The waterways are yet to be rehabilitated and the mine drainage continues to pollute the local river. The federal government will spend $7 million over the next 4 years just determining how to deal with the contamination of the water issue. Not to clean it up, just to determine ways to manage it. And after that research is complete, of course, many millions more will need to be spent to rehabilitate the environment with no history of performance, no guaranteed outcomes, no certainty. So the uranium industry, which is important to note with our friends here from the union movement, it's not only toxic to the environment and dangerous to workers, which is a very important point. History also demonstrates the long-term impact, again, in Ranger Mine, also in the Northern Territory, in the naturally stunning and ecologically diverse Kakadu National Parks. In the last 30 years, that mine has had significant impact on the natural environment with more than 150 leaks, spills and licence breaches. Now, a radioactive spill poses a very real threat of contaminating the land and the groundwater. And we know that in 2009, the federal government was concerned about this and it appointed an independent scientist to evaluate the environmental impact on the mine. And we had some interesting facts come out of that. And one of those was that, among other things, the results revealed that on each day, 100,000 litres of contaminated water was leaking into the ground surrounding the Ranger uranium mine. And this is supposed to be a world's best practice mine. Now, we've heard from Peter about his country, Olympic Dam in South Australia. It's the world's largest uranium mine. And that mine has been approved for expansion without a strategy for the safe disposal of nuclear tailings. You know what the strategy for the disposal of those nuclear tailings are? BHP Billiton detailed it. It's to spread 70 million tonnes of waste that's accrued annually across 44 square kilometres. That's creating considerable risks, and it's been called the radioactive waste mountain of South Australia. It is an incredible indictment that this is the level of regulation that we have for such high-risk mines. Now, it's also important to note that workers on the site have reported their health concerns, particularly given the breaches of the World Health Organization standards applying to plutonium-210, which is a uranium byproduct. These chemicals impact not only on the environment, but also on mine workers. It's also important to note that the uranium industry targets remote communities and Indigenous communities. It's both unfair, it's unsafe, and as we heard from Peter, it divides communities and divides families. So uranium mines are radioactive waste dumps. The waste byproducts from mining are dangerous for many thousands of years, and we cannot leave the legacy of nuclear waste for future generations. But we also have not just a domestic responsibility, not just to the workers, not just to the Indigenous communities in remote and regional Australia and New South Wales, but we also have an international responsibility, because uranium is a dual fuel. It goes to fueling reactors or it goes to creating nuclear weapons. Either way, it creates waste. And in the shadow of the Fukushima disaster, as shocking and as arrogant that the governments, it's shocking and arrogant really that both state and federal governments are opening the way for increased uranium mining and the risky export of radioactive materials around the world. And now we face the prospects of rocks from New South Wales becoming radioactive fallout in other parts of the world. And I was recently at the Hiroshima Day rally where we had a whole lot of our friends from Japan who were at that rally who identified, as we heard earlier, that at least 5 of the 6 reactors at Fukushima, when it exploded in March 2011, contained Australian uranium. So where to from here? What about the steps ahead? Obviously, and we've heard the calls earlier this evening, we need to work together to prevent the nuclear industry from expanding in New South Wales. And one interesting point in the Parliament about this legislation, only for exploration. Why didn't the government move for full mining? We need to recognise, and those of you involved in the peace and anti-nuclear movement need to recognise this as a success. The government wasn't confident to move to full uranium mining. They knew if they did, there might be risks, that people might oppose it, that the latent feeling, anti-nuclear feeling in the community might be reignited. So they just moved to exploration and to see what the next step were. And that's why we need to make the fears of this government come to life. We need to work together with the trade union movement, with community groups, faith organisations, environmental groups to make sure we build a movement that can stop the government moving to the next step. It's also important, I should mention this, the Muckaty, the traditional owners of Muckaty are facing a huge effort to stop the federal government dumping nuclear waste in their country. And I recently met with several women from Muckaty who are talking about the campaign that they've been putting up to try and fight the outcome of the uranium industry, which is waste in their country. I wanted to finish just by talking about the effort that's really important for us to acknowledge. You might have heard that I was in Malaysia recently with opposition MPs and community organisations where a huge environment movement has sprung up in Malaysia, where there was one never before, fighting against the Australian company Lynas, which is mining rare earth radioactive materials in Western Australia and sending them to Malaysia for processing, where it's cheaper, where working conditions are lower, where taxes are lower, in order to make sure that rare earth minerals can be refined in that country. And it's important to remember that that movement has learned from the experience of many, as Luke mentioned, of many of those throughout the decades who have fought on this uranium issue. And it's interesting to note Lynas. People might remember Ziggy Swikowski, the former Telstra CEO, who was given the job by Howard to give the inquiry into uranium power, into nuclear power, and of course that inquiry supported it. He is now the director of this company, Lynas, which is exporting Australia's problems to other countries, where there's a democratic deficit in that country, which means that people and workers are not listened to. So the international impacts of mining in this country are significant, they're ongoing, and we need to fight it. We need to work together to build this groundswell of support amongst the people in New South Wales to strengthen our campaign, and the launch of the Charter is an important part of that. We don't want to see New South Wales involved in this polluting industry, but investing in renewable energy, investing in sustainable technologies that will deliver clean energy, long-term jobs for this state, in particular in rural and regional New South Wales. I want to encourage people to come along to the Uranium Workshop, which is part of us organising people here in New South Wales. It's on Saturday the 25th of August, it's at UTS, between 10 and 3 p.m. It's a full-day workshop where we'll be working on the strategies of how we build our movement to take on the cashed-up corporations who are seeking to impact so heavily on our communities. So can I finish by saying that this government has no mandate to force uranium mining on our state, and we need to ensure that the feelings, which I'm convinced are very deep and strong in our community, and those feelings are that we don't want New South Wales to be a nuclear state. We will fight it, not just exploration, but mining and the whole nuclear cycle. Thank you.